Well, welcome to the structural modeling video conference for July 20th, 2019. And just as a notice, this will be the last video conference we'll be doing with Hangouts on the Air because it won't be available after August 1st. So we will be exploring different types of solutions to provide the online video conference. I have a couple in mind, but we'll need to test those out as we go forward. With that, I'm going to let Kevin introduce the topic for today, which is ISM scalability issues. Okay, Kevin, it's over to you.
Thank you, Joe. In the early 1990s, when I first got involved with interpretive structural modeling tools, I had an interest in being able to model large-scale systems. Some classic cases in the field had to do with what large companies were facing when they try to use quality function deployment on their product lines and their services. For example, quality function deployment you can just think of as a big matrix, and it looks at the relationship of things to each other. So one would typically start with requirements and map the interrelationship of requirements to find out what are driving requirements. And then you may look at the mapping of options to the requirements and so forth. And there's a cascading set of matrices where each matrix is looking at the relationship of an item to itself, like a requirement or options. And then there's also a cross-mapping from one matrix to another, such as options to requirements. In the 1980s, when American companies started to pick up on quality function deployment because the Japanese were using it, they were faced with a scalability problem. For example, Ford Motor Company was doing QFD for a car door, and their first matrix was 300 by 300 matrix. And this took a team of 6 people 3 months to fill out, full time. And it was just considered too overwhelming an amount of work to do it. The reason to do it is because if you caught conflicts in requirements, for example, before you started bending metal, then you may be able to save millions of dollars downstream in product delays or quality problems. So Ford was still interested in doing this type of robust comparison of things like requirements and mapping of options to requirements, but they didn't want to spend as much time on it. And it's one of the reasons I looked into interpretive structural modeling. And Hewlett-Packard reported the same problem, Xerox, Digital, everyone that tried QFD on big product lines, it was a problem. My own case, I was working on a jet engine life cycle. There's over 6,000 sub-processes in that. And it's a big set of 4-inch binders, like half a dozen 4-inch binders of the diagrams that were, at the time we were using IDEF diagrams for functional modeling. And just to do the functional modeling, we're looking at 6 systems that have 6,000 processes across the life cycle of concept to cutting metal. And that was just one IDEF. So IDEF 0 and then IDEF 1X, and that by the end of that decade, they had I think a dozen different IDEF modeling formalisms, all of which can be, or most of which could be addressed by interpretive structural modeling. So my interest in ISM had to do with addressing the scalability problem of doing things like IDEF modeling or quality function deployment. Today, the scalability issue that we're addressing in this discussion and is the subject of some research over in Europe right now, is how do we deal with not half a dozen people, as in the case I was working on. We had a team of a dozen. Ford had a team of a half a dozen on their car door. But what happens if you have hundreds of people? How do hundreds of people have a discussion about a structure? And what are the implications for the mathematics of ISM? And so let me give you some extreme examples. There's been a lot of attempts to do interactive management in the Cognoscope and interpretive structural modeling in various online venues. And in all the experiences I've had over about the last 20 years of those attempts, is the discussion really suffers. People don't end up listening to each other as much. And the techniques for ISM tend towards aggregation rather than deliberation. And this is a classic issue in democracy. You know, can we govern in a democratic way just by aggregating people's utilities? Or does there need to be deliberation from which we get learning and preference shifting and a coming into agreement so that we don't just exist as a polarized society? So at the very extreme of aggregation, so let's suppose we have 100 people we want to listen to each other, and they're all in different locations. So they get into a particular issue, they answer a triggering question, typically answer with half a dozen ideas. And if they listen to no one else, and we then ask them to structure the ideas, they structure their own work, they don't have a discussion with anyone. And then we're left with the challenge of somehow getting their comparative judgments aggregated into the rest of the group. And if they've only aggregated their own ideas, we have to rely on there being some type of similarity, an undeniable similarity between their ideas and some other people's ideas in order to build some type of structure. So that's one extreme. People vote on their own thing, they don't listen to anyone else. And it's not that different than a voting system for aggregation. The next level is someone would listen to everyone else's ideas, and then they'd pick which ones they're going to structure. And so let's say Sally picks 20 ideas to structure, and she structures them. And John picks another 20 ideas he thinks are the most important, and he structures them. Now, if it happens that there is some overlap in what Sally and John thought were important, then we'll have some structuring information. And then all the other structuring information that they added, if there's no overlap in the items they thought were important, doesn't really contribute to the emerging structure. And then at the other extreme, if we have someone, if everyone listens to everyone else's ideas and they structure everything, then we could aggregate total structural information and the total opinions about structural relationships. This is actually a software package for doing that that was developed by Ecotech over in Cyprus, and it runs on a mobile phone, and it feeds you after everyone's added their ideas and answer to a triggering question. It asks everyone to vote on what they think is the most important, and then you start going through the list, or I should say the app prompts you through the list to answer all the pairwise questions the ISM algorithm says we need to answer. And after it has everyone's answers, basically everyone has created their own adjacency matrix. Their package just aggregates it, so just a simple addition. And if there's majority opinions on whether there's a relationship, it says, it adds that as a link and creates the structure. So that's kind of a range of the scalability topics. And things we're thinking about now is if we're somewhere in between these extremes, you know, where someone's listened to a subset of other people's contributions and they've structured some subset that loosely overlaps other people's subsets, how do we assess what we're calling the coherence of that? Or what's the progress on getting a structural model? We came to start calling this coherence and come up with metrics for coherence. A simple metric would be how many ideas of other people did you listen to, and how many ideas did you end up structuring? Well, that's not a single value, so it's not a clean metric, but that gives you an idea of what we mean by a coherence. You know, how much compared to, say, a face-to-face event where you sit there and you listen to everyone and you structure all the same things everybody else does. That's at a higher level of coherence. I think with that, maybe we can open the discussion.
Thank you, Kevin. That was a great overview. Anybody have any comments at this time?
I have a question for Kevin. Kevin, the question is, where does learning and a shared learning and understanding result from what you're talking about? I'm having difficulty with that in particular because my understanding is that a lot of what's put together related to structural modeling has to do with the development of a shared understanding of a given context. And I don't see where that enters into the picture at this point.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if we just start with, say, the nominal group technique phase of doing one of these sessions where we're eliciting ideas in response to a triggering question. In the classic face-to-face, everyone hears everyone's responses. Everyone hears the clarifications of everybody else's ideas, and everyone has the opportunity to ask for clarification of what those what was meant by each person. And in the online world, or if we're doing a large intervention such as they did in the wine villages of Cyprus, they want to engage an entire village, and they can only fit a certain number of people in each room, but they're all meeting in the entire village is meeting in a number of rooms around the village, so they can't all hear each other at once. One, because they just can't sit together, but two, because there's just too many people to listen to at once. So they sit like in groups of 20, but they want to engage hundreds of people at once. And that's not online. But the more typical thing, that the reason that we're talking about this is that there's grant applications that have been going on for several years with the European Union, and they're interested in the scalability of this technology. And so how would you encourage learning when you're everyone's on the mobile phone? So if you just have people reading what a statement is, or reading what a set of relationships are, then the learning is what the person is doing about the situation. And to some extent, they're also learning a bit about perspectives as expressed in those ideas. But they're not learning by dialogue with that person unless we somehow prompt it. So one of the ideas of how to be more efficient at learning with the mobile phone application is to prompt dialogue between a couple or a few people that we think would be the most productive type of dialogue to have. And that might be even more productive than a face-to-face dialogue. So, for example, let's suppose we're looking at the relationship of action A and action B to get some structural information. If say John and Amy both feel that there's a strong directed relationship between A and B, then it's maybe less likely to lead to learning to have those two talk to each other about that relationship. It may be more valuable to have Alfred, who disagrees with Amy, to have a discussion. So the prompting in the face-to-face situation, we force everyone to engage and listen to the dialogue about every relationship, even if they already agree with what people are saying. We don't have a mechanism for saying, oh, you guys can leave the room and save time, have a cup of coffee while we have this 3-minute discussion, right? So there's higher bandwidth in the face-to-face, but there's a lot of inefficiencies because we force people most of the time to listen to opinions they already agree with in the structuring. So that's one example where it actually might turn out to be a better use of people's time to always be in dialogue with someone that disagrees with them.
That's interesting, Kevin. I think there's a number of issues that you appear to be addressing or asking questions about, and they're almost like process-based type of concepts, or contextual types of structuring itself. So, for example, we talked about QFD and the quality house of deployment, and the folks that were working on these huge matrices, and it just took too much time. And that was one specific topic that talked with John Warfield about, and the way that the folks in Japan, when they took his methods and they changed them, the matrix methods, what happened was the way that the matrix was engaged in QFD didn't allow a specific type of logical inference. And so you couldn't use the logical inference to help eliminate a lot of effort. You couldn't infer the answers to a lot of their cells. So one of the things I think that's important is to, or one of the ways that you may be able to address this is to think about, is there a way that you can actually use inference? And what we've shown, what Mary and I have shown over the last couple of years, that there's only a few logical property groups or natural language relationship areas that really work well with the logical inference. But as we talked about on the 1st of July, there's ways that you could use logic and computing to infer other areas. And to think of it simply, the areas that really work well with logic are the ones that are a strict order and that have a global relationship, so everything has its own specific place in the order. But like we were talking about with the ontologies first of this month, you have a multi-threaded system. There's threads that go through that are a strict order, but there's multiple threads. And so I think there's a way that you can actually use the logic and split those threads apart and then reintegrate them over a larger interaction. So I think there's some things that can be done with carefully choosing the type of relationship and then the mechanics that's going to help you analyze the structure. So but again, I haven't seen anyone I haven't heard of anyone ever doing that. But I think those are a couple areas that may be able to provide some benefit.
I think there's a model-centric view of ISM, or the machinery for ISM anyway, has been oriented around what's being modeled. And there aren't any mechanisms for the social network involved, because the social network was always trivial. It was everybody there in a group listening to everything all the time, answering, and then having a discussion about every item. And we don't have an understanding of how, based on what people's views are, the relationship of things in the structure, how underlying coalitions are being formed within the social networks. And there also may be interest in substructures of a big structure, like you're talking about, in the having multiple threads. And may be that it becomes obvious or even preordained that some people are going to deal with one aspect of, or one thread of a structure. I mean, another thing we tend to think about when we talk about doing a structuring exercise, there's a presumption that we're starting from scratch and we don't know anything about the structure, and then it's discovered. And when we're dealing with big organizations like the Food and Drug Administration, which had an interactive management facility full time, they had these structures up on the wall, and most of the time they were working within a structure they had previously developed. And so they were able to divide themselves up into sub-teams and work on different threads of a structure or substructures of a structure. So I think, yeah, the scalability has also to do with how people get organized around substructures of a structure.
Yeah, it can be.
How does this relate to, you're talking about so that if you have agreed upon structure, then that, does that give you global relationships, or at least it's more likely to give you global relationships? Whereas Joe was talking last week about the local, when you're dealing with just relationships that emerge from your empirical questioning of individuals, then you're less likely to get, you're more likely to get local relationships. And then what does scaling mean in that case? So haven't really thought this through, but it seems like those are related questions.
Joe, do you want to?
Well, yeah, I just think that as far as the global relationship, of course, it's like anything that applies globally, like weight. It has some type of mediating artifact that applies to everything. And so, but if you have, let's say, for example, group of people that have some fuzzy idea about a high-level process, let's say, for example. And so if you sketch that high-level process out and show it to everybody, then people can specifically focus in on parts of that high-level process and say whether or not they agree or disagree, or whether it's at the right level of abstraction. So that's really, in my mind, two different things. So like Kevin was saying, like the FDA already had a structured process, already had a structure, and they were just looking at components.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
But they had standardized definitions as well, which gets back to the ontology question. So I'm just wondering about the EU's interest in this scalability. If there aren't pre-agreed definitions, which there will be in cases like weight, there should be, or at least there are in certain professions. But yeah, go on.
I was going to add something about scalability in a European context. I'd be interested in your opinion. The language of Europe is a sort of European English, and different languages and different cultures obviously have different meaning constructions in their own language. And then that gets translated into a conception of English that person has. And in my experience in recent EU projects, is that level of mutual understanding of the meaning of the words in English varies enormously. Not only that, the constructing of sentences or statements is not rooted in a common understanding of the structure of the English language, but it's more related to the structure of the thinking of the culture and the language of the originating person, who then translates it into English as they understand it. So I'm really interested in how you deal with that kind of issue as a precursor almost to the technical aspects of the argument structuring that you're talking about. And I think it would apply in the United States or an English-speaking country anyway. I mean, even in England, the number of different dialects are enormous. And obviously in the United States too, the English language has many variants. So I don't know how you think about that or address about that in the European context, never mind the English-speaking American or English-speaking environment.
Yeah. Well, interactive management, as Warfield and Christakis and Ozbekhan were originally developing it, was in part inspired by an experience they had out. I think it was out in the Midwest. There was a number. I forget the particular situation, but there was a number of people involved with a project, and they were from all different disciplines. So their disciplinary languages did not mesh. It is back in the early 70s or late 60s. And they specifically evaluated methods. They went through about 70 methods to see which ones would help them with the making a group more productive, and the languaging aspect was an important one. But what they were addressing was the disciplinary languages and those barriers. And I think they found, they ended up picking the methods that help with the languaging issue. But I mean, they didn't do things specific about translation or agreements on definitions and things like that. I mean, they did it through dialogue using primarily the nominal group technique, and then interpretive structural modeling and clustering, where a lot of agreements on what something meant came about, but they didn't have a clean methodology for the clustering.
Yeah. Well, that's helpful to reiterate, I guess. But the issue of scalability then that you were referring to in the Cyprus example, I think is interesting too, with people in different locations, in different group settings, and how you may pass out people who have differing connections or perceptions so that you can get them talking together more quickly rather than those who may be in more agreement. I mean, there's a sort of sorting exercise in some quick way, and then how that fits in with reading something in English. Obviously, because many people in Europe particularly find it easier to read English than perhaps listen to it, or some may prefer rather than reading it. There are other issues there in terms of scalability about preferred mode of absorbing information, either orally or textually. Another constraint or challenge.
Right, and all of this gets back to Mary's point about the group learning. All of this maybe comes under the heading of group learning and dialogue and coming to a mutual understanding. So then the question is, which techniques best support that group learning activity, or however the groups are defined, however the need for learning is identified. Yeah, it reminds me of the Checkland issue of the soft systems question of is the model a reflection of reality, or is it a boundary object for I guess he didn't use that language, but for facilitating mutual understanding.
Yeah, just as a orientation to this, maybe a different words to characterize the set of problems I'm trying to address is the interpretive structural modeling, interactive management, Cognoscope, this family of methods typically used with groups of a dozen to 3 dozen people, sometimes 4 dozen, in a rare case, maybe 80 people, and in a few instances, 300 people. And so it's mostly been a small group, and the stakeholders' interests are represented by a small group of participants. Usually the issues we're dealing with involve projects I was involved with involved millions of people as stakeholders, and we only had 80 people in the room to represent them. So it was like a Senate, right? We didn't represent the population that was affected in a proportional manner. They were represented. Each perspective had an equal weight in terms of the number of participants, and it's pretty much divided up by discipline. What's happened, the interest now, the reason we have a scalability issue, there's people in this community of this practice that want to apply interpretive structural modeling and those tools to problems of democracy. When we're talking about democracy, the smallest unit would say be a neighborhood or a village, where you have maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people, and you'd like them to all be involved somehow. Now, there's an underlying tone that there's a shift of interest from representative democracy to direct democracy. Now, I'm not saying that that it's a valid target to try to do direct democracy. In fact, I think it tends to undercut the legitimacy of people that are talking about using ISM for democracy. Because it's hard to, if you want to do direct democracy, you have to require everyone to participate. Everyone must participate. And and they're not necessarily going to put the time in that's necessary to deal with it. And so there's reasons we have representative democracy. But that is the tone that is started being pursued by Christakis and Ken Bausch when he created the Agoras, and Tom Flanagan, who is the head of the Agoras. If you look at their writings, they're always talking in terms of there's a blurring between who's the participant versus who's a stakeholder. It was always presumed the participants are not there on behalf of all of the stakeholders. The stakeholders are not in the room, but they would tend to use the terms interchangeably. So anyway, if you talk about really engaging all the stakeholders, then you have a scalability issue. It's impossible to have everybody, if you have 1,000 people and everybody contributes about 5 answers to a triggering question, that's 5,000 issues to listen to. And that would take, for a particular case, that would take it over a month just to sit and listen to everyone's position or idea, right? We typically deal with like 100. Maybe I've been in events that had 300 ideas over the course of several days. You can do 300. 5,000, you're talking on the order of months. And so how do you balance this interest in engaging as many of the stakeholders as possible, along with the interest in the robustness of doing ISM or even just listening to people? That's kind of the kind of a backdrop.
Well, Kevin, I think there's an interesting point here. And that point is that in ISM and in structural modeling, essentially of the two languages, one is the object language, of course, which is mathematics, which you create the structure from, and then the meta language, which you talk about the object language, which is natural language. And so using mathematics as a formal language, then you can do many things with it that you can't do with natural language. And that almost every natural language has some access to talk about a formal language, mathematics. So in my mind, the key is to be able to specifically address the structural formal mathematic components correctly. And then once you have that, does a person, an individual person, like you're talking about, let's say you got 5,000 ideas, but let's say 3,000 of them are the same, and they're the same structure. So people can be shown the mathematical representation, and they don't really need to listen to the verbal representation. And if they can agree with what they're shown in the mathematical format, then the verbal natural language comments may be able to be strongly short-circuited, but the information still be conveyed. And so I think that's an area that hasn't really been explored much. But the key part is having a formal mathematical representation of the structure. And do people understand that? Can they understand that no matter what their natural language is?
I think you have two reasons why you would want to ideally hear from every stakeholder. One is for requisite variety, that you want to be sure that you're not missing some local insight that someone might have that other people don't share. And the other is buy-in. And this question of if you can show the mathematical or the graphic, if you can show the formalized representation and help people see more quickly what the structure is, then maybe you can shortcut the process of getting buy-in, but you're still going to deal with human nature that will say, well, I haven't expressed my version of it yet, even if, I'm not going to agree yet that my version is the same as Sally's version, until I put it in my language, and then ultimately, an hour later, maybe say, oh, that was the same thing after all. Anyway, so making sure you get all of the insights and getting buy-in seem to be different challenges. And the formalisms and the graphic, the ability to quickly show different kinds of mathematical and graphical structures should help, certainly not hurt, if there can be tools to support that.
Yeah, it would be a nice problem to have if the people are saying, well, you haven't heard my thoughts on this yet. That's the good problem to have, because those people are going to want to contribute. The more pernicious problem is apathy. And I'll give you a simple case. We did a project where it was amongst 20 or so practitioners in the Christakis camp, so Christakis world, and it was on the future of democracy and how the practice could be used in democracy. And half the people in that didn't really participate after they agreed to. These are supposed to be the leaders. You know, I think that's one of the problems is even when people have agreed to participate in something, when for some reason when it's online, we get very poor quality participation.
That's interesting.
There's been a lot of projections of, wait till we have the great tools to organize this online, and then people can do it on their own time. They'll be able to focus when they want. They won't have to leave their office. And I've been involved with things going back to the online stuff, going back to Lotus Notes before we had big applications on the internet. And it was an online application, but it was, called up by modems. And there's just not been I haven't heard of any system, not just SDD or interactive management, ISM, any of this. I haven't heard any online deliberation platform that's been judged to be more successful than a face-to-face thing. And I'm not sure.
I could give you an example.
Yes?
Yeah. I think so. I think our work that we did on ocean literacy is an example, and it was 18 years ago, and it's and the same thing with earth science literacy. We just couldn't have done it. Well, first of all, we couldn't have done it face to face, either of them, for budgetary reasons, and then second of all, the first criteria on all of these things is establishing the social process. You can't expect the technology to lead. And very often with these technological offerings, the assumption is that the technology will lead. And the technology does not lead. It's the social process that leads. And it's crucial that that is managed and designed ahead of time with sufficient clarity of purpose and support and facilitation. Otherwise, you will experience what you've experienced, which is less than satisfactory performance.
What do you mean by social process?
Well, what I mean by social process is by designing the whole experience to reflect the intent of the idea, to draw people together in knowing that they are part of an important group, that they can self-identify and identify each other, have some mutual recognition in the process, just as you would in a face-to-face where you get visual recognition, and that you do some fairly heavy facilitation. So you have an agenda and you have particular mini targets on a day-by-day basis, and that you then summarize what's going on and feed it back by email or other means so that there's constant engagement over a limited period of time, so that you increase the channels of communication in an email and an online forum setting that essentially substitutes for the lack of synchronous presence and direct interaction. So
but I'm wondering how much of that is transferable to the case that Kevin was talking about with the future of democracy. So I think the most important thing you said there was that they feel like they're part of an important process.
Yeah.
But that's so that you don't. I think that they might have believed going in, and you reinforced it. I don't know if the people that Kevin was dealing with, how could that have been conveyed? Or did they already believe that it was an important process? I know the enthusiasm that the literacy people had, and I think you're talking about channeling it and
Yeah.
supporting it,
Yeah.
and making sure that the technology doesn't interfere with it,
Correct.
but it actually does support it. I think with Kevin's case, I don't think that just having a different structure would have substituted for that lack of sense of mission. I guess maybe that's a distinction there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was, I mean, in Peter's case, there was a destination for this work, and with the Christakis project, there wasn't a clear destination for the results. That's for sure. But also, I think another difference is what I'm talking about. I haven't seen work is when when people have tried to take an existing face-to-face process and then implement it online. And that's what I haven't seen any successful transitions like that. It sounds like what Peter was doing, there wasn't an existing standard method for what they were doing. They were doing something completely novel,
Right.
and they couldn't bring the people together. They'd never tried to be together before, and there wasn't like a set practice for it. And they created the practice online organically.
Correct.
That's an interesting point. I mean, here we're we're trying to take face-to-face technology and re-envision it for doing existing in the online, decentralized, large scale.
Well, I'm obviously very interested in this. I mean, that's why I've been hanging out with you as much as I can,
Yes.
because
Yes.
I want to see this happen somehow, and over the next 6 months we are having a more focused effort on systems literacy to bring that to a level of coherence by the end of the year. And I wonder whether any of these approaches could be considered at some stage, depending on where you are in the sort of technical development and how much one could get one's hands on it and think about how to organically engage or involve with it. Anyway, I don't know at the moment, but that'd be an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, well, I mean, modes of going online with structured dialogue or ISM are using things like Hangout here and basically doing the face-to-face process in a synchronous way, and that works fairly well. When we get into the asynchronous mode, where people are not having face-to-face discussions, I haven't seen that work as well. Participation drops off. The numbers of things other people read others' work drops off. The quality seems to suffer.
Yeah.
And so, is there something in between that we can do?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm wondering about, obviously, because I've got experience on the not structured in a particular way, not in the specific way as ISM or structured dialogue, but structured in other ways, and the feeling of potential equity of contribution, of value, and of logical structuring of arguments or positions or responses, is appealing. A number of those, qualities of ISM, so it would be interesting to think about that, even for us to apply it in some small way in a subset of what we're thinking about doing.
Kevin, until what you just said there, it hadn't occurred to me. I wasn't realizing that the online face-to-face, so there is online face-to-face, and maybe that is primarily what, Peter, you did in your literacy efforts.
No, we didn't do any video work at all. It was
Oh, no, I don't mean video. I mean listening in real time rather than,
no, we didn't do any of that either. What we did do is we did do daily video summaries. So we did do, short video synopses of what's been going on and pointers and encouragement and lots
what
of.
was going on? What do you mean what was going on?
Well, I mean by people adding responses in textual terms in a forum setting. So we gave them the sense of urgency. We gave them the sense of belonging. Gave the sense of relevance.
So were they like editing a wiki or?
No, it was with just one. It was streamed. A forum kind of thing. You'd say something, and then someone would follow on underneath, and so on. And but we'd also have different settings where you would have different paces of conversation. So just as like in the meeting in Corvallis, you had a variety of different forms of presentation, whether it be plenary presentation or a plenary discussion or a round table or a coffee break or a
But those
break.
were all, I'm now considering all of those, those are all real time. They're all
Yes.
vital.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is that those metaphors in mind, we recreated in an asynchronous arrangement, and you would have, so instead of perhaps a 15-minute coffee break, you might have a morning coffee break, so that people would have an opportunity asynchronously across different time zones to engage in a coffee break like conversation, but they would know that, it had a beginning and an end, but it was just time shifted a little bit. But the nature of the conversation would be more, could be initially more lighthearted and sort of, and then could go off into serious side discussions, that kind of thing. So,
We're getting close to the end of the hour here, folks. This has been really great. So, and as I mentioned when I first started, this Google Hangouts goes away. The one we've been using goes away on August 1st. I've I've identified a new service called StreamYard that kind of does essentially what this service does, but I'll need to test it. So anybody that's willing to help test that out here in the next week or so, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know.
yeah, I'm happy to do that.
All right. Well,
Send me a note when you're doing it.
okay. I'll send it out, and it's we'll see if we can get that happening here and make the transition. And if that doesn't meet our requirements, then it will be open to looking at other things. It's been a very good discussion, and it's opens up a number of issues from an operational standpoint. In my mind, it's also opens up a number of issues from a software architectural standpoint, because you'd want to be able to be flexible and have different approaches and interfaces for different groups. So let's see, August, take a look at the August 3rd is the next one. I'll try to get a test set up for sometime next week and send out an email to Kevin and Peter for that test. And is there anything else we should talk about before we sign off?
I take from Peter's experience, it'd be really helpful for us to have, to think of the metaphors for new architectures of ISM to address large-scale groups.
Yeah, let's work on that. Maybe we can do that this week in the test on stream.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right then. Well, with that, I wish everybody a happy July, and I'll see what we get going next week.
Thank you,
Thank
Joe.
you, everyone.
Bye-bye.